some of the most formative literary events I ever experienced. We all have these. Many of these occurred early in my university studies. A visit by Allen Ginsberg to campus, Ishmael Reed's workshops, Rimbaud racing as in flames down the corridors. That didn't really happen. Or the Volcan poets in San Francisco, my H.D. William Carlos Williams, and Shakespeare professors at Berkeley, all very notable, mind-blowing mind meddlers. Specific instances where all the writing I admire spilled out from the shelves and blew forward from the past to make sense precisely in the time and place of their reading. Such moments are moments where one finally gets it. These are moments one yearns to provide to students. These are moments when one connects with the real sense of words, their density, their multiplicity, their substance, the spaces around them, their reality, as real as thinking, as Creeley writes. As real as thinking, wonders created by the possibility, formed, a period at the end of a sentence, which began, it was, into a presence, saying something as it goes. Then there have been a few of these I get it, or as Creeley would have said, I dig moments, or moments where you might say, I am here, which is really all you can ever really hope for. For me, these included the Glazier conference in Vancouver, where I got to fly back with Charles Bernstein for one of our first long conversations, I think. Various events here, including Creeley's 70th birthday event, visits by McClough, Ashbury, and others, the presence of Howe and Bernstein and the conduit of the poetics program of the time, one characterized by uncommon generosity, as well as ePoetry 2001 and 2011, which both took place in Buffalo. Among these moments, of course, Bernstein's previous extraordinary Buffalo Creeley lecture, offering far greater vistas than the 9th floor of Clement's lecture room, from which he gave it a decade ago. Standing out in all this history is, of course, the kind Creeley spoke literally here, in this room. To imagine you could just walk into this room and he'd talk, he'd read, he'd be here. What did Creeley mean by here? He was asked about this in his Art of Poetry interview in the Paris Review. The interviewer asks, you speak a great deal about the poet's locale, his place in your work. Is this a geographic term, or are you thinking of an inner sense of being? Creeley replied, I'm really speaking of my own sense of place, where the heart finds rest, as Robert Duncan would say. I mean that place where one is open, where a sense of defensiveness or insecurity and all the other complexes of response to take place can finally be dropped, where one feels an intimate association with the ground underfoot. Now that's obviously an idealization, or at least to hope for such a place may well be an idealization, but there are some places where one feels a possibility more intensely than others. As to place, Buffalo is where Creeley entered his mid to later work. Creeley's later work, I must confess, my own earlier resistance to some of its themes. For example, his poem O goes like this.
Stay a while, sad, sagging flesh, and bones gone brittle. Stay in place, aged face, teeth, don't go. Inside and out, the flaccid change of bodily parts, mechanics of action, minds collapsing, habits, all echo here in mottled skin, blurred eye, reiterated mumble. Lift to the vacant air, some sign, I'm still inside.
I think part of me resisted the process of aging that Creeley never feared to address directly. Part of me wanted to be assured that Creeley would never be gone. I took hope in the fact that his mottled skin, blurred eye, i.e. his aging body, he asserted that yes, he was still inside. I saw that as meaning that his being was still here, even if his body was aging. But looking at the poem again and again, I note the extraordinary form he gave to the material of this poem. This occurs throughout the poem's mechanics. mechanics of action, a sort of chain reaction like language dominoes falling as they ladder, leading to the last two lines. Looking just at the last two lines, we can see the formal culmination of this progression. The penultimate line consists entirely of the phrase some sigh, some sign, creating a horizontal base, divided by a comma, the pairs of words reflecting each other exactly except for one detail. That is, there is one change in the reflection, like a sole imperfection in a mirror. It consists of the change, not even of one letter, but of just one half of one letter. The top part of the H of sigh is dropped to become the N of sign. That really makes me want to sigh. Finally, the trembling sigh-sign duality penetrates to the poem's final line in the form of an inverted pyramid anchored in the inside of the next line. But get it, it's not just another sigh-sign, but another variant side, a sound that is within inside, literally inside. This inverted pyramid of sound, descending from the penultimate line, literally penetrates the poem's final line, offering an afterlife of sound, a sense by which the form and meaning are fused in a mechanism that transforms the poem, its possible meaning, its own existence in time. The profundity of this textual revelation is one that continues to amaze me to this day. As I tell my students, as a life achievement, I'd be happy having written one good line, a line that people could revisit over subsequent years, each time getting something new. I ask no more than writing one good line. But if that's not in the books for me, then at least having read one good line, if bees are few, will do. After Creeley passed away, I understood the profundity of it all. The fact that this revelation continues to thrill me, that I am mortified and thrilled and dizzied by the way an H turns into an N, and that it's not that says it all, means that that structure has managed to be something that is indeed here. And though Creeley's bodily presence did change, one can see the ultimate profundity, that as that revelation continues to reign, he is still here, not just metaphorically, but literally. And truly, what amazes is that it's just as he said, some sign, some sigh. And yes, it's here, as real as thinking, still inside. This method of allowing such a literal text to speak comes from all the formative moments mentioned above. It comes from speaking to Creeley while alive, to you honoring him here today. It comes from readings, the poetic program of that time. It comes from Bernstein's way of seeing through Creeley's eye, spoken straight from the heart, as an eye that is not I, but that is always the I inside. Bernstein's ninth floor lecture on Creeley was a moment where one was here and one could see. It was a moment that I've ever since hoped to visit again, and here it is, in the context of this 20th anniversary of the UP Poetics program, in honor of Robery Creeley, in celebration of the EPC, a site that both Creeley and Bernstein relished with enthusiasm. It is certainly crucial to have Charles here. It is equally profound to have Creeley here as well. It is a tremendous honor to welcome Charles Bernstein here.
In 2006, there was a panel in Bob's honor at the MLA, and I put together this montage of different poems of Bob, so I thought I would start by reading that. The plan is the body. There is each moment a pattern. There is each time something for everyone. The plan is the body. The mind is in the head. It's a moment in time, an instant, second. The rhythm of one, and one, and one, and one. The two, the three. The plan is in the body. Hold it an instant. In the mind, hold it. What was said, you said. The two, the three times in the body. Hands, feet. You remember. I I remember. I speak it. Speak it. The plan is the body. Times you didn't want to. Times you can't think you want to. You. Me. Me. Remember. Me. Here. Me wants to. Me and thinking of you. The plan is the body. Body, the sky is the sky, the mother, the father. The plan is the body. Who can read it? Plan is the body. The mind is the plan. I speak it. The memory gathers like memory. Plan. I thought to remember. Thinking again. Thinking. The mind is the plan of the mind. The plan is the body. 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 Time is some sort of hindsight or else rhythm of activity, e.g., now it's 11 days later. Also alive, like they say. Oh no! Where it is, was, will be, never. Only here, fluttering as falling leaves, knives, to avoid tunnel down the vague sides. It, oh no. If you wander far enough, you will come to it. And when you get there, they will give you a place to sit for yourself only, in a nice chair. And all your friends will be there with smiles on their faces. And they will likewise all have places. You are always with me. There is never a separate place. But if in the twisted place I cannot speak, not indulgence or fear only, but a tongue rotten with what it tastes, there is a memory of water, of food when hungry. Some day will not be this one. Then to say words like a clear, fine ash sifts like dust from nowhere. There is each moment a pattern. There is each time something for everyone. The mind is the plan. I speaking. The memory gathers like memory. Plan, I thought to remember. Thinking again, thinking. The mind is the plan of the mind. The plan is the body. 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 So that's a montage from The Plan of the Body from Away. And here's the obituary I wrote for him, which I have wanted to read here in Buffalo. It's published in the Brooklyn Rail. Hero of the Local, Robery Creeley and the Persistence of American Poetry. On March 30th, 2005, as the sun rose across the mountaintops surrounding the highland plains of Marfa in southwestern Texas, Robery Creeley died, surrounded by his wife Penelope and two youngest children, William and Hannah, who had arrived at the regional hospital in Odessa just in time to see him through the dawn. The poet who made the struggle for breath a central part of post-war American poetry, who turned the wheeze and gasp and the stutter and the faint into an exquisite art of intimate articulation, had struggled for his own breath throughout March. In email messages he sent to dozens of his friends during the last weeks, Creeley spoke of living off champagne bottles of pure oxygen, and even sent pictures by email in which he looked dapper as ever, with an infusion tube darting across his face like an upside-down mustache. Creeley also sent out pictures of the mountain views of Marfa, where he was staying on an arts residency. This quintessential poet of New England, born in Acton, Massachusetts, and whose ashes are interred at Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, died a sojourner in the American West, near the border of Mexico, in a scene that evokes nothing if not the climax of a John Ford film. Creeley, who was born in 1926, was active right up to his last weeks, both writing poems and giving readings. His last appearance in New York were at the Q Art Foundation Gallery on January 19, 2005, and the next day at a memorial celebration for the saxophone jazz innovator Steve Lacy at the Poetry Project at St. Mark's Church. Creeley's connection with artists and musicians was long-standing, going back to his days at Black Mountain College in the 1950s. Indeed, Creeley was a prodigious collaborator, working with visual artists such as Susan Rothenberg, Francesco Clementi, Robert Indiana, R.B. Kitai, Alex Katz, Archie Rand, Elsa Dorfman, Marisol, Jim Dine, and many others. At Q, Creeley remarked at how often he appeared at memorial services. He no doubt felt himself to be the last left standing from his generation of poets. Actually, John Ashbery is probably the actual last person standing from that generation now. But his reading was as vivid and particular as ever, and there was no sign of what was to come, though anyone who has read Creeley's poems of the last 2 decades will not miss the intimations of mortality that appear like pointless dots of grass in a Seurat painting. Creeley's final talk and reading was 1 month later, on March 19th, at the University of Virginia, home of Thomas Jefferson. But perhaps more significant for Creeley was Edgar Allan Poe's ever-lit dorm room at the edge of the campus, a spectral reminder of the black soul that possesses the poetry of this too often dark land, a darkness that Creeley did not so much dwell within as engage in as ongoing, often defiant conversation. He wrote his only libretto based on Poe's Ligeia. Creeley had come to Charlottesville as part of a Walt Whitman celebration, and one of his last essays was on Whitman's late poems. The foundations of American poetry are often said to rest on 2 radically different approaches: Whitman's expansive, sexually explicit, and exuberant verse, and Emily Dickinson's philosophic, hermetic, introspective poems. One measure of the genius of Creeley's poetry is that he synthesizes these 2 directions, outward and inward, by creating a body of work that has as its heart a formal paradox. Call it quantum poetics. The quantum poetics is nowhere more evident than in Creeley's radical use of the line break. Creeley reimagined the poetic line as a means of registering microtonal inflections. His achievement in this respect is just the opposite of the minimalism that was often used to mischaracterize his work. Creeley's exquisitely precise lines measure the pressure of reality through their articulation of emotional rupture and turbulence. Breaking every 2 or 3 words, his lines also, and in contrast, can be read as materializing the language, making it linguistically concrete, heard as words as much as for what the words might mean. What from one perspective is an extremely fragmenting prosody is from another a highly charged music of felt intensities. The experience is one of rhythmically charged, exhilarating oscillation as waves of thought break into particles of sound. While this achievement is present in his earliest work, it reaches its initial height in 2 collections, Word, 1967, and Pieces, 1969. Creeley's poetry is as much about enunciation as instance of it. Here again, the bifurcation of being in and beside reveals a dynamic conflict at the level of form. With Words and Pieces, he began to process the bracketing of the I, so that the poems that treat the I as a third person, as soon as I speak, I speaks. The direct, expressive voice of the poet yields to an articulation of voicings in the poem. Creeley's earlier poems, collected in For Love, poems 1950 to 60, explored regions of male sexuality, aggression, anger, frustration, futility, loss, and disorientation, as well as tenderness and love, in a way rarely, if ever, articulated in American poetry. Creeley's poems of this period didn't try to cast the darker part of male consciousness in a positive light. His interest was not in a moral discourse that condemned or condoned, but an active poetry of thinking and encountering. The result, startling in the context of the 1950s, was A Form of Men, to reverse Creeley's title, A Form of Women, that expressed weakness and uncertainty and linked it contingently to violence and love, eros and disaffection. Creeley's often gloriously stuttering poetry of the 1950s used many of the trappings of lyric poetry, but he played outside the tune as surely as Charlie Parker, only to come back around to it again, making it strange and familiar at the same time. From the 1970s to his last years in Providence, he began teaching at Brown in the fall of 2003, so that's when he left Buffalo. In fact, we both left Buffalo in 2003. Creeley continued to write poems with the intensity and unexpectability of his earlier poems. If readers grew to expect this from him, that too is a measure of his achievement. Over these years, Creeley published dozens of books, usually gathering recent work in small editions from micropresses across the USA, and subsequently collecting the poems in a series of major publications from New Directions. During the 1980s and 90s, Creeley ceaselessly toured North America and Europe, giving dozens of readings each year, and apparently quenchless, not to say restless desire to be on the move. For Creeley, the test of the poem was in its performance, the particular insistence that makes a poem different as it travels from place to place, ear to ear. Throughout this period, Creeley was immensely responsible to a wide range of poets, supporting their work through encomiums and recommendations, or just plain listening. In his late work, Creeley composed some of his most formally elegant and structurally complex poems, Helsinki Window being a perfect example. Meanwhile, his loops, poems whose tails eat their heads, emphasize a continuing interest in charm and riddle forms. Throughout, he used his distinctive line breaks to mark a frequent subject of his poems, the transitory nature of the daily and the ties that bind and blind. Creeley's late lines flicker and pop like the snapping shutter of a photojournalist shooting the blank. Of third-wave modernist poets, those born in the 2 decades following 1910, Creeley was one of the great champions of the new American poetry, from the Beats to Black Mountain, New York School to San Francisco Renaissance, and with Jerome Rothenberg, one of the most consistent adversaries of official verse culture. He took his charge from Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, Charles Olson, and Louis Zukofsky, each of whom offered a specific model of poetics that he transformed into a powerfully resilient core that remains central to contemporary practice. In his essays, prefaces, encomiums, and through his many decades of teaching at SUNY Buffalo, where Susan Howe and I worked with him for 14 years, all stemmed from a set of poetic principles that he often reiterated and elaborated in quick graphs, as he called an early set of essays that formed the basis of an activist approach to poetics that remains a bulwark against poetic uniformitarianism and complacency. Creeley's poetics were not designed to generate specific types of poetry, either stylistically or formally. They are provocative rather than proscriptive, and they fomented an approach to poetry that remains the antithesis of the neatly laundered poems of the poet laureates and Pulitzers. This presents a stark challenge to an approach to poetry that begins with the ideas or sentiments or messages, then represents or approximates them in a poem. Composition, including editing and recomposing, becomes the active agency of the poem. Immediacy and imminence of expression precedes essence. A couple of great one-liners underscore the concept. The first was picked up by Olson in Projective Verse, an essay which remains central to U.S. poetry mid-20th century. Form is never more than an extension of content. But Creeley's corollary is the ringer. Content is never more than an extension of form. The other one-line koan for the poetics of process is an answer Creeley gave to a question from an audience member after a reading. Is that a real poem, or did you just make it up? He just made it up. By the same token, a poem is not a summary of something thought, but an arc of thinking. This is the temporal dimension of poetry, in which words move in time. In this sense, poetry is allied not to the visual arts, but music and film. Creeley's next principle follows on the first. Not like the night follows the day, but like one foot follows another when walking. Poetry is not made of ideas, but words. Creeley was not without his Poundian don'ts, especially never write in generalities if a particular, a detail, a specificity would do. Not the tree, not the father, not the poet, not the right, not the tradition, nor the conventional, but particular instances of any of these. And yes, Matilda, even abstractions can be given concrete form. The poet best averts universal truths in favor of the non-generalizable specifics of form and rhythm and vocabulary. This is what Gertrude Stein called insistence. Creeley's equal emphasis on both the particular and the common is another one of his paradoxes. For it is the particular within the common that is the obscure object of his desire and frequent frustration. The common is not one thing or one idea believed by all, but a shared space in which our individual differences converge without disappearing. A commons is a place of dispute and provisional agreements, a convention, not a conversation, a particular place, not a universal claim. In Creeleys Prosody, and here the mark of Zhukovsky is evident, we count by ones, a serial order in which the contingency of the next is honored, and each word, nouns no more than prepositions, carries its own weight. This is a poetics not of subordination, but of the sublimity of the modular and the local, each part doing its part against an horizon of a whole that never arrives. For Creeley, a poem is the fact of its own activity. It exists in and of itself, for itself, so that we can relate to it not just as an expression, but as an enactment. This is not so much an objectification of the poem as a picture of the poem in the world, as a thing, requiring not mute appreciation, but active response. Of course, American poetry has never been and could never be Dickinson verses with it. There is always the X factor, poetry that combines the Dickinsonian and Whitnerian. Call it by the name of Poe, or Crane, or Lloyd, or Williams, or Stein, or Glazier, or Rich, or Scalapino, or Creeley. It's sad since I wrote that to both Audrey and Rich and Leslie Scalapino died. A few days after Creeley's death, Charles Alexander spoke of Robery Creeley as our poetic connective tissue. So many poets had an intimate relation with Creeley. He had a way of connecting with each of us in particular, and through that connection with him, to a company of poets in the U.S. and around the world. In his quick grasp, Creeley also connected us to a set of poets who constitute a living path for our art. From this perspective, Creeley is not only one of the major innovators of post-war poetry, he is one of the great American poets, as he vanishes from our everyday life, where, for me, as for so many others, he was a palpable presence in an ongoing conversation, Creeley joins that company of poets who have invented and reinvented the conversation of American poetry over the past 200 and more years. If he can no longer be our companion in the way he has been, for many of us for our entire lives as poets, his companionship is inscribed in the words he wrote in his poems and essays and letters. Then what is emptiness for? To fill